As noted in the published agenda, the subject for today's session will be expansion plans for the DGR project. I would like to note that we have a number of government departments on standby in the event that the panel has any questions for them. We will now proceed with presentations by OPG, CNSC, and Environment Canada pertaining to the subject of expansion plans for the DGR project. The panel will hear all three presentations before proceeding with its questions. I would now like to call on OPG to begin their presentation, which is based upon PMD 14-P1.1E. Ms. Swamy, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Dr. Swanson and members of the panel. My name is Lori Swamy. I'm the Senior Vice President responsible for decommissioning and nuclear waste management for OPG. Today, OPG's presentation is on the potential future expansion for the DGR facility. Mr. Jerry Quito will provide our presentation. Mr. Quito is OPG's Vice President of Nuclear Decommissioning. In this capacity, he is accountable for managing OPG's decommissioning liability for all of its nuclear assets, including the upcoming shutdown of the Pickering Nuclear Generating Station. He is accountable for the execution of the DGR project. Mr. Quito.
Good morning. For the record, my name is Jerry Quito, Vice President, Nuclear Decommissioning for Ontario Power Generation. I'm joined this morning by Dr. Paul Grashevsky, Director of Safety and Licensing with the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. The purpose of the presentation today is to discuss the potential future expansion of the low and intermediate level waste deep geologic repository. I will discuss the considerations for an expanded facility that was assessed as part of the design development for the various components and phases of the project. Dr. Grachevsky will provide an overview of the assumed decommissioning waste characteristics and the impacts of these additional wastes on conventional safety, as well as both the pre- and post-closure safety assessments. I will then discuss the relative timelines for a business decision to expand the DGR, bounding it by the earliest timelines to accommodate decommissioning waste, and the latest being the end of the planned DGR operational period. As noted in the 2013 hearings, OPG are not requesting a site preparation and construction license for an expanded DGR to accommodate decommissioning waste. Any future expansion of the facility would require a separate and complete regulatory and environmental approval process. Consistent with the EIS guidelines, an expanded DGR for decommissioning waste was considered a foreseeable project, and as such, was considered in the cumulative effects assessment. However, there are several uncertainties that can influence a future decision to expand the DGR facility. These include the volume of waste to be received, the characterization of the waste, and when the waste will be received. These will then influence the design of the facility expansion and support the preparation of the pre- and post-closure safety assessments. OPG received 3 information requests related to the potential future expansion of the DGR. EIS 12-512 requested OPG to provide a technical assessment and all associated reports for a proposed DGR to dispose of decommissioning waste from the Darlington, Pickering, and Bruce nuclear generating stations, as well as the anticipated timing of these expansion activities. Although such a formal standalone technical assessment was not completed as part of the environmental assessment, the considerations for expansion of the DGR facilities and structures, assumptions of decommissioning waste volumes and characteristics, and planning timelines were provided and will be discussed in this presentation. EIS 12 Alpha-512 requested further clarification of the consideration for conventional safety of occupied underground areas for the extended timelines, short and long-term safety implications, and a graphical representation of the relative timelines for the conceptual expansion. EIS 12 Bravo-512 requested the maximum doses for each of the preliminary disruptive scenarios provided in the response to EIS 12 Alpha-512. Slide 5 shows the relative positioning of a conceptual DGR expansion layout at the Bruce nuclear site. North is to the right of the slide. The expansion, optimizing existing infrastructure, repository access, and positioning within the Coburg Formation, is south of the proposed DGR. While the surface installation is contained within the proposed DGR project site, the expanded underground footprint is not closer to Lake Huron and is within the boundary of the Bruce nuclear site. Supported by the detailed characterization activities for the current DGR application, it is expected that the Coburg Formation can accommodate the additional panels to the south of the proposed DGR. This will need to be verified through future site characterization with additional deep boreholes. It will also incorporate experience gained through the construction and operation phases of the proposed DGR. As mentioned in the previous slide, an expansion would utilize the existing infrastructure at the site. Consideration in the sizing and configuration of underground services and ventilation have accounted for the potential of future expansion. The underground openings have been designed for nominal 100-year design life. This was done to accommodate the potential for extended monitoring periods beyond the operations phase, as well as to provide for repository decommissioning activities. Geomechanical modeling and ground support have also been considered for these extended periods. A description of proposed ground support methods, as well as monitoring and replacement were provided in OPG's information request response. The potential safety implications of an expanded repository will be discussed later in this presentation. Ventilation requirements and remobilizing for future construction have also been considered in the design. As these are required for the initial construction, they would need to be reestablished for expansion development. After the initial DGR construction, those systems and equipment not required for operations will be dismantled and removed so as to not require ongoing maintenance and management. Waste emplacement would cease prior to expansion, and the in-place waste would be isolated by closure walls. As such, environmental emissions from the future development would not be different from that of initial construction. It is assumed that similar construction and development techniques, for example, conventional drill and blast, would be employed for the expansion. Therefore, there is no impact on the conclusions of the cumulative effects assessment with respect to underground construction. Future surface impacts are limited to the OPG project site and planned facilities and structures. The only noticeable change is the increased size of the waste rock management pile. As described in the IR response, the waste rock pile would increase in size from 9 to 11 hectares, and the height of the pile would increase from 15 to 35 meters. The sizing of the stormwater management pond will be further assessed by OPG and the CNSC as agreed in the 2013 hearings. However, the ultimate sizing of the pond is not expected to be impacted by the expansion development. All other facilities and structures, as proposed, can accommodate future construction activities. As mentioned in the previous slide, this will include reestablishing equipment. For example, reinstalling hoisting equipment at the ventilation shaft and associated waste rock handling systems. Emissions associated with surface activities will be consistent with those of the planned construction activities as it is assumed that similar equipment would be used during the expansion. As most of the facilities will already exist, there would be less surface disturbance during expansion than during initial construction. Therefore, there is no impact on the conclusions of the cumulative effects assessment with respect to construction of surface facilities. There are very limited changes in operational activities in an expanded repository. Prior to the initiation of construction, the Western Waste Management Facility would need to have sufficient capacity to store waste during expansion construction. Also, the emplacement rooms underground that are filled with waste would need to be isolated through the establishment of closure walls. All waste emplacement activities will cease. Following construction, operations would resume with no material changes in the pre-closure safety considerations from that of the proposed DGR. This is further discussed in slide 11. There is no impact on the conclusions of the cumulative effects assessment with respect to operations. I would now ask Dr. Grashevsky to discuss the nature of the decommissioning waste and the considerations of an expanded DGR on both the pre-closure and post-closure safety case.
Dr. Paul Grashevsky for the record. We do not have detailed information at this time on the volume and characteristics of the low and intermediate level waste from decommissioning. This characterization will be determined many years from now, closer to the period when the waste will be generated as part of decommissioning of the stations. However, we know the general nature of the waste and have made preliminary estimates to support planning. The waste types are expected to be similar to waste currently received from operations and refurbishment. The amounts of the various waste types will be different, and the total radionuclide inventory will be higher. It is estimated that there will be approximately 135,000 cubic meters of as-packaged waste without consideration for volume reduction. About 10 to 20% of the total package volume will be intermediate level waste. These account for the bulk of the radioactivity. Assuming that all reactors initiate decommissioning 30 years following shutdown, the total radionuclide inventory is estimated to be 390,000 terabecquerels. This information, although preliminary, has been used to provide a safety assessment in response to this information request. The preliminary estimate for decommissioning waste assumed that most metal waste would be simply disposed as is. This estimate results in a large amount of low-level waste metal. This in turn would result in large amounts of hydrogen gas generation within the repository over long times. Since this is mostly surface contaminated metal, there is opportunity to reduce the metal content of the waste. Importantly, the net result would be the same radionuclide inventory, but a smaller amount of metal to be accommodated within the repository. This would be considered as part of future updates to the estimates for waste from decommissioning. The conventional safety considerations for an expanded DGR are very similar to those of the planned DGR. Although the expansion would extend the operating life of the facility, relevant underground structures have been designed for a nominal 100-year life. Furthermore, the repository design takes into consideration the inherent requirements for long-term stability. The DGR planned geotechnical activities will monitor the effectiveness of ground stability over time. Where required, ground support would be augmented or replaced. We note that there are examples of facilities operating over these periods of time in similar geologic settings, such as the Norton Mine in Ohio, which has been open since the 1940s. The photo shows the Barberton Mine in the U.S., which is at similar depth to the DGR and was operated for over 40 years. During operations, the radiological impacts for the assumed decommissioning inventory would be similar to those for operational refurbishment waste. This is because the waste package off-gassing of volatile radionuclides, such as tritium and carbon-14, would be similar. For workers who could be exposed to gamma radiation, such as from cobalt-60, the OPG radiation protection requirements would ensure that the worker doses would remain within the OPG dose targets. Therefore, there is no impact on the conclusions of the cumulative effects assessment. As per the information request, post-closure dose impacts for waste from decommissioning were estimated. However, these impacts are based on very preliminary calculations and would require detailed waste characterization and a revised safety case with detailed analyses. This slide summarizes the potential impacts of including decommissioning waste within the DGR. It shows the maximum calculated dose rate for 3 normal evolution scenario cases and 4 disruptive scenario cases. These results generally show an increase in the maximum dose due to the increased inventories of key radionuclides in the expanded repository. However, doses would remain orders of magnitude below the dose criterion for normal evolution scenarios and within the risk criterion for disruptive scenarios. Therefore, there is no impact on the conclusions of the cumulative effects assessment.
Jerry Quito for the record. The following slides illustrate 2 planning scenarios for a decision on expanding the DGR to accommodate decommissioning waste. The early and late scenarios show the range and timelines from which a decision could be made. In both scenarios, it is assumed that additional DGR site characterization would be required to support a decision to proceed, and an additional 4 years would be required to prepare for and obtain regulatory approval for expansion. As much of the site infrastructure to support development will be in place, construction is assumed to be approximately 4 years. In both cases, a decision to expand the DGR would be made in several decades. The early scenario aligns with the earliest possible dates that low and intermediate level waste from decommissioning could be available. This assumes that decommissioning starts approximately 30 years following the safe storage period. As such, a decision to expand the facility would be required by approximately 2035, preceded by site characterization activities to have the facility available to receive waste by approximately 2044. This timing also coincides with the filling of Panel 2 and allows for the initial closure walls to be installed. Following construction of the expanded repository, the operations would resume and continue for approximately 50 years, extending the life of the DGR by approximately 30 years to 2095. The start of decommissioning for both Darlington and Bruce nuclear stations also assume that decommissioning occurs 30 years following shutdown. The late scenario is driven by the end of the planned DGR operations in the early 2060s. A decision would be required to expand the DGR facility for decommissioning waste or close and decommission. Decommissioning waste from Pickering would need to be placed in interim storage pending a decision to expand. Should the decision be to expand the DGR, Darlington and Bruce nuclear station decommissioning activities would occur following the expansion and could be received directly. The operations phase to emplace decommissioning waste is reduced in this scenario, and as with the early scenario, emplacement activities are complete in 2095. In conclusion, OPG is not seeking approval for the expansion of the DGR for decommissioning waste. The placement of decommissioning waste in the DGR is a planning assumption. There are many uncertainties that would influence the scope and timing of such an expansion. However, expansion has been considered as part of the design and the EIS through cumulative effects assessment and is considered to be both technically feasible and not likely to result in significant adverse environmental effects.
Thank you very much.